The summer I learned how thin the line between loyalty and longing could be, started with heat pressing against my skin like a hand that wouldn't let go. The air in our small town felt heavy, thick with dust and secrets, and I remember thinking that nothing truly bad ever happened here. I was married, settled, predictable. My life moved in neat, careful lines, the kind that didn't invite chaos. Or so I believed. Every morning, I woke before my husband, moving quietly through the kitchen so I wouldn't disturb him. I liked the silence of those early hours, the way it made me feel like the only person awake in the world. Coffee steaming in my mug, sunlight sneaking through the curtains, my reflection in the dark window looking back at me like a stranger. I told myself I was happy. I said it so often it started to sound true. Then he came back. He was someone I hadn't seen in years, someone who used to live down the road when we were younger, someone whose name still felt unfinished on my tongue. He returned to town for the summer, just passing through, or so he claimed. The first time I saw him, it was at the old grocery store near the highway. He stood in the narrow aisle, holding a basket with only a few things inside, like he didn't plan on staying long. Our eyes met, and something shifted. It was small, barely noticeable, like the moment before a storm breaks. We exchanged polite words at first, careful, distant, the way people do when they're trying not to remember too much. But the past has a way of rising up between sentences, filling the space with things left unsaid. I told my husband about running into him, casually, like it meant nothing. And maybe, in that moment, it didn't. But later that night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I thought about the way his voice had sounded, lower than I remembered, steadier. I thought about how my heart had betrayed me by beating just a little faster. We started crossing paths more often. At the gas station, on the sidewalk near the river, in the small cafe that barely stayed open through the summer. It felt accidental, but I knew it wasn't. We began to linger, to talk about everything except the one thing that sat between us like a fragile glass waiting to shatter. He asked me about my life. I gave him safe answers. I asked him about his. He gave me half-truths and smiles that didn't quite reach his eyes. There was a pull I couldn't explain, a quiet gravity that kept drawing me closer, even as a voice in my head told me to step back. One afternoon, the heat became unbearable, and I found myself walking toward the river, not really thinking about where I was going. He was already there, sitting on the old wooden railing, looking out at the water like he was searching for something he'd lost. We didn't say hello. We didn't need to. We talked about the town, about how small it felt now, about how strange it was to come back and see everything the same but also completely different. The conversation drifted, slowed, settled into something deeper. He told me he felt like he didn't belong anywhere anymore. I told him I felt like I belonged everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The silence that followed was heavy, charged. The kind that says more than words ever could. I could feel the weight of my wedding ring on my finger, suddenly too tight, too loud. I twisted it without realizing, a nervous habit I hadn't had in years. He noticed. "I don't want to be a problem," he said quietly. The honesty in his voice cut through me. I wanted to tell him he already was, that he had been the moment he walked back into my life. Instead, I told him it was fine, that everything was fine. The lie tasted bitter. We sat there until the sun started to sink, painting the water gold and red. When I finally stood up to leave, my legs felt weak, like I'd run a long distance without moving at all. He walked me part of the way, our shoulders brushing, a simple touch that felt too significant to ignore. That night, back in my bedroom, my husband asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling again. The room felt smaller, tighter, like the walls were leaning in. I replayed every moment, every look, every pause. I knew I was standing at the edge of something dangerous, something that could change everything. And the worst part wasn't the fear. It was the fact that, deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to turn back. The days that followed felt like they were moving too fast and not fast enough at the same time. Every morning, I went through the motions of my life, smiling at my husband, answering his questions, listening to him talk about work, about plans for the weekend, about things that suddenly felt far away from me. I nodded, I laughed in the right places, but part of me was always somewhere else, replaying the sound of a familiar voice by the river, the way the evening light had caught in his eyes. I tried to avoid him. I really did. I changed my routes through town, skipped the cafe, told myself I had errands to run on the other side of the highway. But the town was small, and memories have a way of shrinking space. One afternoon, as I was loading groceries into my car, I heard my name. I froze before I turned around, already knowing who it would be. He stood there, leaning against his old truck, arms crossed, a half smile on his face like he wasn't sure if he was welcome. The look on his face wasn't confident. It was cautious, almost uncertain, and that made my chest tighten. "I didn't mean to corner you," he said. I haven't seen you in a few days." I told him I'd been busy. Another safe answer. Another small lie. We ended up walking down the street together, keeping a careful distance between us, like there was an invisible line neither of us wanted to cross. We talked about the weather, about how the summer storms never lasted long here, about how everything always seemed to dry up by morning. The words felt like a cover for what we really wanted to say. He stopped in front of the old movie theater that had been closed for years, its sign faded and cracked. "Remember this place?" he asked. "We used to sneak in through the side door when it shut down. Thought we were so clever." I smiled despite myself. We were terrible at being subtle. The memory brought a warmth that was dangerous, a reminder of a time before responsibility, before rings and promises and carefully built lives. I could feel myself slipping, just a little, and that scared me more than I wanted to admit. He grew quiet then, his gaze fixed on the broken letters above the entrance. "I didn't come back here looking for trouble," he said. "But I also didn't expect to feel like this." My heart thudded against my ribs. Like what? Like I missed something I didn't realize I'd lost. The honesty in his words made it hard to breathe. I thought about my husband, about our home, about the life we'd built piece by piece. I thought about how steady and safe it was, how predictable. And I thought about how this moment, standing in front of a forgotten building with someone who knew my past, felt like standing in a doorway to something unknown. "I'm married," I said, the words heavy, deliberate. "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm trying to be careful." Careful didn't feel like the right word for what was happening between us. Careful didn't describe the way my hands trembled at my sides, or the way my pulse raced when he stepped a little closer, not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of him. We stood there, suspended, until the sound of a passing car broke the spell. I took a step back, creating space where there hadn't been any before. "I should go," I said. He nodded, disappointment flickering across his face before he masked it. "Yeah, of course." That night, my husband asked me if everything was okay. He said I seemed distant, distracted. I told him I was just tired, that the heat was getting to me. He accepted it, like he always did, trusting me without question. The trust felt like a weight on my chest. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, listening to the quiet rhythm of his breathing, staring into the dark. I wondered when exactly things had started to shift, when the ground beneath me had become unsteady. I wondered how easy it would be to fall if I stopped fighting it. The next day, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. It was simple, just a few words and a time, a place by the river where the trees grew thick and the path curved out of sight. My hands shook as I held it, my mind racing through all the reasons I shouldn't go, all the consequences that waited on the other side of that choice. I told myself I would throw it away. I didn't. When the sun began to dip low in the sky, painting everything in soft orange and purple, I found myself walking toward the river again. Each step felt heavier than the last, like my body knew what my mind was still trying to deny. He was already there, standing in the shade, watching the water move past like time itself, unstoppable and indifferent. When he saw me, relief washed over his face, followed by something deeper, something that mirrored the storm inside my own chest. We didn't speak at first. We didn't need to. The air between us was thick with everything we hadn't said, everything we were about to risk. And as the light faded, I realized I was no longer just standing at the edge. I was stepping forward. The moment I reached him, the space between us felt smaller than it ever had before, like the river itself was pressing us closer. The air was cooler here, shaded by the trees, but my skin was warm, almost burning with the awareness of him standing just an arm's length away. I told myself this was where I would draw the line, where I would finally say the words that would send me back to my safe, predictable life. But when I opened my mouth, nothing came out. He broke the silence instead. "You came. I shouldn't have," I said, and even as the words left me, I knew how hollow they sounded. He nodded slowly, like he understood more than I wanted him to. "I know." We walked along the narrow path beside the water, our steps matching without us trying. The river murmured beside us, steady and unbothered, like it had seen 1,000 moments like this and would see 1,000 more. I told him about my husband, about how kind he was, how reliable, how he never raised his voice or forgot an anniversary. I talked about the house we shared, the routines we'd built, the future we planned like it was a straight road with no turns. He listened, really listened, his eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, he said, "That sounds like a good life." "It is," I replied. "It's just quiet." The word hung between us. Quiet, safe, predictable. I didn't say the part that followed in my head. Empty. He stopped walking and turned to face me. "And what do you want?" The question felt too big, too dangerous. I looked down at my hands, at the ring that caught the fading light. "I don't know," I said, because it was easier than admitting the truth. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw tightened like he was holding something back. "I don't want to be the reason you lose everything," he said. "Then why did you ask me to meet you here?" I shot back, more sharply than I meant to. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about you," he admitted. "Because pretending I don't feel this isn't working." My heart pounded so hard I was sure he could hear it. I took a step back, my heel catching on a root, and he reached out instinctively, his hand brushing my arm to steady me. The touch was brief, barely there, but it sent a jolt through me that made my breath hitch. We both froze. His hand lingered, just for a second too long, before he pulled it away. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. I shook my head. "Don't." The word slipped out before I could stop it. He looked at me, searching my face like he was trying to read something I hadn't decided how to write yet. The tension between us felt like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. I thought about my husband's trust, about the way he kissed my forehead every morning before leaving for work. I thought about the note under my windshield, about the way my feet had carried me here without hesitation. I thought about how standing here, on this narrow path by the river, felt more real than anything I'd felt in a long time. "I can't keep pretending this isn't happening," I said. He exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath for days. "Neither can I." We didn't rush. There was no sudden movement, no dramatic pull. We just stood there, close, closer, until the space between us disappeared. When our lips finally met, it was soft, hesitant, like we were both testing the ground to see if it would give way beneath us. The world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact, to the way my hands trembled as they came up to rest against his chest. The kiss deepened, and with it came a flood of everything I'd been holding back. Guilt, longing, fear, relief. It all tangled together, impossible to separate. For a moment, I forgot about rings and promises and the life waiting for me beyond the trees. I forgot about consequences. I forgot about tomorrow. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads rested together, our breaths uneven. "This changes things," he murmured. "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We didn't talk about what came next. We didn't make plans or promises. We just walked back the way we'd come, side by side but not touching, like we were both trying to process what we'd just crossed. At the edge of the path, where the town came back into view, he stopped. "I don't regret this," he said. I wanted to say I didn't either. The words caught in my throat. All I could manage was, "I don't know what I feel." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll be here, whenever you figure it out." I watched him walk away, his figure growing smaller with every step. By the time I reached my car, the sky had gone dark. The reflection in the window looked different now, like someone who had stepped into a story she couldn't rewrite. That night, when I slipped into bed beside my husband, I lay awake, staring into the shadows. The quiet I used to find comforting now felt deafening. I knew I had crossed a line that couldn't be erased, only followed forward. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the guilt and the fear, there was a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Anticipation. The days after felt like I was living two lives at once. On the surface, everything stayed the same. I made breakfast, folded laundry, answered my husband's questions, listened to him talk about work and plans and the future he assumed we were still walking toward together. Underneath it all, my mind was somewhere else, replaying the river, the kiss, the look in his eyes when he said he didn't regret it. I told myself I could keep it contained. I told myself it could stay as a moment, a mistake, something that happened and then faded. But moments like that don't fade. They echo. He didn't reach out at first. Neither did I. There was a strange, aching space between what we'd done and what we were going to do next. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped. Every time it didn't, I felt a twist of disappointment I hated myself for. My husband noticed. He always did. He asked if I was okay, if something was bothering me. I told him I was just tired, just stressed, just thinking too much. He pulled me into a hug one evening, resting his chin on the top of my head like he always had. The familiarity of it almost broke me. I stood there, wrapped in the safety of a life I'd built, and felt tears burn behind my eyes for reasons I couldn't explain to him. The message finally came late one night. Just a few words. Can we talk? I stared at the screen for a long time before I replied. Yes. We met in town, away from the river, away from the places that had started it all. The air felt different, heavier, like it knew what we were carrying. He looked tired, like he hadn't been sleeping much either. I've been thinking about that night, he said. About what it means. So have I admitted. He took a breath. I don't want to be a secret. And I don't want to be the reason you live with regret. The words hit harder than I expected. I wanted to argue, to say it wasn't that simple, to say feelings don't fit neatly into right and wrong. But deep down, I knew what he was really asking. What are you going to do? He asked gently. I didn't answer right away. I thought about my husband's steady presence, the way he trusted me without question. I thought about the life we'd planned, the routines, the quiet comfort. I thought about the spark I'd felt by the river, the way I'd felt seen and alive in a way I hadn't in years. I don't know how to live with both, I said finally. Something has to give. He nodded, pain flickering across his face. I figured. We stood there in silence, the space between us filled with everything we couldn't fix. For the first time since this began, I felt the weight of my choices settle fully on my shoulders. There was no version of this where no one got hurt. That night, I went home and couldn't sleep. I lay next to my husband, listening to his breathing, watching the rise and fall of his chest. I thought about the promises we'd made, about the future we'd imagined. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who believed love was enough to keep everything in place. In the early hours of the morning, I made my decision. The next day, I sat across from my husband at the kitchen table, the sunlight streaming in like it always did. My hands shook as I wrapped them around my mug, even though the coffee had gone cold. There's something I need to tell you, I said. He looked up, concern in his eyes. You're scaring me. I took a breath, then another, and told him the truth. Not every detail, not every feeling, but enough. Enough to be honest. Enough to be fair. The silence that followed felt endless. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, strained. Why? I didn't have a simple answer. Because I wasn't happy the way I thought I was, I said. Because I felt like something in me had gone quiet, and I didn't know how to fix it. He stood up, pacing the room, running a hand through his hair. I could see the hurt, the confusion, the betrayal. It was the hardest thing I'd ever watched, knowing I was the one who put it there. We talked for hours. We cried. We argued. We sat in silence. By the end of it, nothing was resolved, but everything had changed. When I left the house that evening, I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there, not yet. I found myself back by the river, the place where this had begun. He was there. We didn't run toward each other. We didn't touch. We just stood, a few feet apart, two people caught in the middle of something bigger than either of us. I told him, I said. He nodded slowly. How did it go? Bad. Honest. Necessary. He looked down at the water, then back at me. And now? I stared at the river, at the way it kept moving no matter what stood in its path. Now I figure out who I am without pretending, I said. Without hiding. He stepped closer, not close enough to cross that line again, but close enough to feel. Whatever you decide, he said, I hope it's for you. Not for me, not for him. I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle in my chest. We stood there as the light faded, not as lovers, not as strangers, but as two people who had changed each other in a way that couldn't be undone. I didn't know what my future looked like. I didn't know who would be in it. All I knew was that I had stepped out of the quiet, predictable life I'd been living and into something uncertain, painful, and real. And for the first time in a long while, even with everything I stood to lose, I felt like I was finally awake.